show. Hello, darling. Hello, hello, hello. Everybody get up, let's go. I'd like to welcome all of you to the show. Positive Impact Speak.
What am I grateful for? So you got me, because that's what I ask everyone. In this moment, I am grateful for grace. I'm grateful for the fact that we can always get another chance, and I feel like grace has been such a big thing in my life. I've not always gotten it right. I don't always do it right, and so I have that ability to lean on God's grace and also have grace for myself and for others. So that's what I'm grateful for.
Since you moved here, how has grace affected yours and your family's life?
Yeah, since our move here, like, grace has really affected our lives, because what you'll hear in some episodes with the kids, you'll hear that, you know, their transitions were each different. And I think them having grace with my husband and I, such a big transition. I think my husband and I having grace with one another. But the biggest thing would have to be the grace and the providential timing of God in this season. Like, he has been so gracious to us. I tell people the story of the move, and they just cannot believe how the pieces came together so seamlessly. What else could that be? Like, what else could that be, right? But the hand of God, but the grace of God. And so when stuff started happening, I would just say, all right, God, now you're showing out. Because at first it was like, oh my goodness, this is such a blessing, this is amazing. And then it gets, and it's like, you're really showing out. Like, this is really too much for me to handle, because I know how, I guess, like, feeling undeserving, right, that we feel, but that is the grace of God. I have children, 3 children, and we think, oh my goodness, we're not deserving. And he's so loving. You know, I can't love my children as much as he loves us, but I don't do things for my children because they deserve it per se. I do it out of love. And so I would say that feeling the love of God just because he loves has literally been a guiding force for us this season. I know that was a long way to answer that question, but
Could you start by telling us a bit about your podcast and what inspired you to relaunch it?
Yeah, so the Wake Up and Show Up podcast was born on a beach in South Africa, and I realized that I was not living this amazing life, crazy life that we all have intentionally and with impact. It just was kind of going through the motions. So the Wake Up and Show Up podcast really is a podcast of stories and interviews that weaves together life's pivotal moments and the decisions that we make to intentionally show up and impact our world. Because we may not impact millions of people, but we can impact the people in our world. And so I get the opportunity to talk with incredible people and share stories about those pivotal moments and how they're showing up and impacting their worlds. And your second question was the relaunch of the podcast, right? What caused me to relaunch it? And can I go back and say kind of why I stopped or why I took a break? Is because when I started this podcast, I loved podcasting for podcasting. I loved podcasting because I realized that it was making an impact, right? It wasn't impacting millions of people like I initially thought, right? But I'd only been in it like a few years, but I knew it was impacting people. I knew they were listening to the stories, and some people were starting their own organizations, or some people were saying, I'm living differently. And but I stopped because that why shifted. And it was no longer about impacting people, but it was about impacting numbers. And it was about, well, this isn't monetizing and everybody else is monetizing and following everybody else's flow. And I feel like I needed to pause so I could get back to the why and get back to what really mattered for me in podcasting. And so that's why I paused. And so I'm relaunching because I found that why again. I think I'm in a really good place emotionally and spiritually and mentally, and I just want to show people, specifically I am 44 years old, and I definitely want to show people who are of a certain age, 40s, 30s and 20s, but in a world where youth is so very important, that you could get to this age and feel like, well, all my dreams, all my visions, all that stuff, I'm too old for it. And so I want people to see the podcast, and I want them to be inspired to write the book. I want them to be inspired to go feed the homeless. I want them to be inspired to go back to school, or whatever that dream is. Miles Monroe would always say that the richest place is the graveyard. And it is because we leave this earth with so much that we didn't accomplish, but so much in us. And so if someone listens to a podcast like I did, that will say, I'm going to start the podcast. I'm going to go take some pictures. I'm going to go be part of the PTA, whatever it is. So I feel like the relaunch of this podcast is so that people will be inspired to live this beautiful thing that we call life with purpose and with impact.
What is your desire for this next season of the podcast?
As far as like the goals for this podcast, okay. So what I desire for this season of the podcast, for me, I will say is that I will be as committed to it as I was when I first launched it, when it was just about the impact, where the numbers were not the driving force. That's what I perceive for this season. I do want people to come in and hear the stories, and we have some incredible interviews lined up with incredible people. And whether or not they go and do their own thing, or whether or not they come in and they support somebody else that we have on, another organization. Sometimes we're not called to create maybe our own, but we're called to really support that. So I hope that, again, that when people hear this season of the podcast, that they're inspired to do the thing that they know that they're called to do, that they change a mindset, that they impact someone, in their world, as I like to say. Yeah.
You guys, I was saying earlier, you can tell you love podcasting. And does this love of podcasting come from your love for people, and ultimately God's love for you to be able to shine through your love for people?
That's such a good question. Do I do podcasting because I love people? Yes. So it's funny. My children and my husband, sometimes they're like, we're scared to let you go somewhere by yourself because you are always so friendly, like you're meeting people. And so secretively, I do my podcast so I can meet people, so I can hear stories. I love stories. And so it's so funny because I can meet someone literally walking my dog in this neighborhood, and I've learned so many stories about people in such a small amount of time, and all of those stories matter. And I think that sometimes we don't realize how our stories matter. And so I do this podcast because I want people to know that their stories matter. And when they hear other people's stories, it gives them permission to share theirs. It allows them to know that they're created on purpose, for a purpose. So yes, I selfishly do this podcast because I get to meet incredible people, but I love people. And so it really is a way to tell those incredible stories of people who are, building multi-billion-dollar, nonprofits or whatever. And also the little lady that has a coffee truck that I had in Georgia. So that I had on the podcast in Georgia. So it is all of those stories culminate this beautiful thing that we call life. Yeah.
Can you share your personal experience with living intentionally and why you believe it's important?
Yeah. Can I share my personal story about living intentionally? I was doing amazing in my career. So I tell people all the time I didn't leave corporate. Oh, this makes me tear up. I didn't leave corporate because it's a big bad wolf. Most people are like, corporate is terrible. It was so amazing. I had such a great career. I was traveling. I was working in hospitals. And so, but I remember my daughter she went into school, it was like one of the first weeks of school. And they did this, tell me about yourself. And they said, what is one thing you love about your mom? And she was like, she's such a hard worker. And I was like, oh yeah, And then one of the questions was like, what is something you wish she did less of? And she said work. And I was like brokenhearted because I'm like, wait a minute, what is going on? So that's like August. Fast forward to that October, November. My husband and I take a trip to South Africa. And we're on the beach in Cape Town. It's absolutely beautiful. It's this big moment of life, right? And I say, John Henry, I feel so connected being with you on this beach. And he says, Portia, I feel connected to you whether I'm on this beach or whether we're having a coffee date. And I cried my eyes out because somewhere he had still been living intentionally where the small moments mattered. But for me, I had been going through the motions. I had been a wife and a mom and doing all the right things, but not taking in consideration that moments matter. And so it was on that beach that I decided that how many people are living unintentionally, not thinking about the moments that are mattering in their lives. And so that's kind of my story.
So good.
With transitioning from corporate to now living more intentionally, what did you learn from that you also took in your transition from Georgia to California?
Mm-hmm. That is a really good question. So transitioning from corporate into becoming an entrepreneur, one of the reasons why was I wanted time with my children. And I realized how important time is. I realized it in that transition, and in the transition from Georgia to California, it was about time, spending time. And so I think one of the things that I try not to do is take time for granted, whether it's my children coming to ask me if he has time to make some soup before I do this for the world. I'm going to take that time and I'm going to talk to him. Or whether it's my daughter that needs 5 minutes, but maybe I have something I could be doing, I'm going to take that time. Or maybe my husband needs to talk through something. So for me, it is being intentional about those moments. And so I've taken that from my corporate career into, entrepreneurship, into the podcast, and then definitely into our transition is that I didn't want to rush this moment. I didn't want to just be like, okay, God, you did all these amazing things. We're here. Yay, the sunshine. But I wanted to take those moments to breathe and be like, wow, God, you did amazing. And I love that my family is still together even after a big move. And I love that my children are thriving after a big move. So making sure that I'm so grateful for time and spending that time.
How do you translate this concept of intentional living into your podcast, and how do you hope it resonates with your audience?
Yeah. So how do I translate the concept of intentionality or intentionally living into the podcast? I think I'm really, I won't say picky, because I'm not in that way, but I am so The podcast is my baby. So I wouldn't let anyone just come give my children advice the same way that when, people are like, I want to be on a podcast because I want to be on a podcast. Well, that doesn't work here, because whether or not your audience is 200,000 or 2,000 or 200, it really is about what impact are you making and the motive of that impact. Where's it coming from? And so when it comes to the podcast, I have like a pre-interview so that I can understand who's coming to give advice, to my children per se. And so I just, the questions that I ask and trying to hear their stories of the way that they're showing up in the world and how they're impacting their sphere of influence, whatever that looks like. So I try to translate that into the stories and the interviews that I tell.
Can you share some examples of guests or stories that particularly exemplify this idea of making an impact?
Yes. Can I share stories of interviews that I've done that exemplify intentional living and making this impact? I've had incredible guests. I've had like some incredible people, but right off my head would be one, Kitty Murray. She is the founder of Refuge Coffee, and they started out in Clarkston, Georgia. I went to high school in Clarkston, Georgia, and what they do is they have a coffee truck. Look at that. And they give jobs to refugees. And so not only do they give them jobs, but they train them in coffee making, in business, and how to run the trucks. And so they've been able to expand. So Kitty Murray would be one. Marquita Goodwin would be another one. She was a breast cancer survivor. And I remember from her interview when she said, when something's going on, whether someone has breast cancer, or maybe someone's lost something, or, they're going through a tough time. She said that when people would ask her, what can I do? She was like, I didn't know. So she would always say, just do it, right? So just come by the house and see, do you need me to take the kids, or send a meal, or send a coffee, or send a tea? So she was incredible. I would say Letzigo Zulu from South Africa. Her and her husband were climbing Mount Kilimanjaro, and unfortunately she tragically lost him. However, she does so many things. She is still keeping his memory alive. She wrote a book. I read the book. She supports another organization called Caring for Girls. And so that is Robert Mabasso. He is the founder of Caring for Girls. And what they do is they provide feminine hygiene products to girls in South Africa and around the continent, because they miss about, I can't remember the number because it's been a minute, but they miss school. Some of them drop out because they don't have what they need. So that's just like off the top of my head, a couple of impactful interviews that honestly you can go watch right now.
And are there any interviews for this next season that you can tease us about that also share stories of intentional living?
Yes. So I guess I'll give you a little teaser. One of the people that we are interviewing is Kevin Adler, and he wrote a book, When They Walk By, and it is about homelessness and the work that he is doing around homelessness. And it is a beautiful story. And so that just kind of gives you a little teaser of where we're going in this season of the podcast. So yeah.
And to go back, I don't know if you necessarily already answered this, but if you want to add to why did you stop podcasting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so why did I stop podcasting? I think I did answer, but I will go back, is that I lost the joy of the why because I allowed what everyone else was doing, what every other podcast looked like, what their numbers were, how they were monetizing. You go to these conferences that are absolutely incredible, and I've had the opportunity to speak at a really incredible podcast conference, podcast movement, but you go and you see what so many people are doing, right? Or even you look at the Joe Rogans of the world, right? Just because his podcast is so, everybody knows that podcast. I don't care what you listen to, what your niche is, you know his podcast. And so you look at that, and when your numbers don't line up, when you feel like, I think for a while I was like, I was putting so much into this podcast, and the numbers, what am I doing wrong? And so it is very easy to forget your why, to look at what other people are doing and feel like you have to change to fit that. And a couple episodes I did, and I felt terrible because I knew that wasn't me. That's not my podcast. I tell real stories about real people making a real impact, and there are people who want to hear that. But when I stopped, I didn't see it that way. And so, yeah, I just felt like I'm not good enough. But I know differently now.
So life has changed. Even your perspective, like you said, you know differently now. So can you give us an update on what's happened since your last podcast episode?
Yes. So a lot has happened since my last podcast episode. But what I will say is you'll hear a little bit of it in some episodes this season. But my family and I relocated from Georgia to California. Something that we have wanted to do for many, 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 many years. And this was just the opportunity that God gave us. I keep saying that this is our season of Sabbath. It's a season of rest. It doesn't mean like we're not doing anything, but it is a season of rest. And so, yeah, me and my family on May 22nd, once our kids got out of school, we hopped on a flight, landed in LAX, and California has been home for the last 60 something days, and we are loving it. We are absolutely loving it. So that has happened. John Henry and I continue to run our consulting business, and the podcast is back. So those are like some big life updates, yeah, that has happened since the last podcast. So this season of the podcast, we're super excited because we are a video podcast now, and I cannot wait to see you as you join us on this journey of impact.